$5 million? The words, spoken in a voice as crisp and cool as the polished marble floor, hung in the air of the private client lounge. They weren't a question. They were an accusation. Serena Monroe, the branch manager of Prestige Financial's flagship Chicago location, stood with a posture that could have been carved from granite. Her suit was a blade of charcoal gray, her hair a sleek architectural marvel. Not a single thread was out of place. She surveyed the woman seated before her gaze a slow, meticulous inventory of perceived flaws. The faded denim of the jeans, the soft, worn cotton of the t-shirt, the scuffed leather of the simple boots. Each item was a mark against her. The woman, Eleanor Vance, didn't flinch. She had anticipated the disbelief. She had, in fact, counted on it. Inside the pocket of her worn denim jacket, her fingers brushed against the smooth, cracked surface of an old photograph. It was a picture of a woman with a smile that could outshine the sun, standing on the porch of a small, proud house. Evelyn, this is for you, Eleanor thought. A silent vow that cut through the sterile, air-conditioned quiet. I'm bringing you home. That's correct, Eleanor said, her voice even and calm. A cashier's check for $5 million. I'd like to begin the withdrawal process. Serena's lips thinned into a bloodless line. She moved with an unnerving grace, her heels clicking softly on the floor as she rounded the mahogany desk to stand beside Eleanor, looking down at her. It was a subtle, deliberate assertion of dominance. Of course, Serena said. The words clipped. Before we can proceed with the transaction of that magnitude, we require extensive verification. Proof of funds. Origin of funds. I'll need to see your identification. Eleanor had already placed her driver's license and bank card on the desk. They were from a smaller regional bank in Appalachia, a deliberate choice for this test. They were legitimate, tied to a holding account, but they didn't scream billionaire. They whispered lucky lottery winner, at best. Serena picked up the license as if it might be contaminated, holding it by the very edges. Her eyes, sharp as obsidian chips, scanned the name. Eleanor Vance. The address was a rural route number. Another demerit. This card, Serena said, gesturing to the bank card, is not associated with Prestige Financial. It's the source account, Eleanor explained patiently. The funds will be transferred from there. Your parent company, Vance Technologies, acquired Prestige 6 days ago. Your internal systems should reflect that I have full access. A flicker of something annoyance crossed Serena's face at the mention of the acquisition. It was a disruption to her carefully curated domain. The integration is still in process. Systems are not fully synced. This changes nothing about our security protocols. In fact, it makes them more critical. We must be vigilant against opportunistic fraud during a transition. Her tone implied Eleanor was the very definition of an opportunist. From a corner of the lounge, a young, impeccably dressed man with a slick tech bro haircut snickered into his phone. He didn't even bother to hide it. A few other clients, cocooned in leather armchairs and sipping complimentary espresso, glanced over, their curiosity piqued by the low-grade drama. This was a theater of wealth, and Eleanor had clearly missed the costume memo. Eleanor met Serena's cold gaze. She had faced down hostile corporate boards, ruthless venture capitalists, and software glitches that threatened to sink her entire company in its early days. This woman's condescension was just another line of bad code, an error in the system that needed to be identified and purged. Run the name, Miss Monroe, Eleanor said, her voice still quiet but now with an edge of steel. That should be sufficient. Serena placed the ID back on the table with a dismissive tap. I'm sure you understand that a name and a plastic card are not sufficient for a $5 million withdrawal. It would be irresponsible. It would be negligent? She let the word hang in the air, a veiled threat. Where did you get this money, Miss Vance? The question was a direct challenge to her entire life, to the sleepless nights, the years of sacrifice, the sheer force of will it had taken to climb from a shack in the mountains to the pinnacle of the tech world. It was a question Evelyn had never had to ask. Evelyn had simply believed. Eleanor's hand tightened on the photograph in her pocket. She thought of Evelyn's house, stolen by this very institution 30 years ago, through a predatory loan, cloaked in promises. They called it the legacy fund back then, a legacy of ruin. Eleanor was here to settle that debt, to erase that stain. The money wasn't for a supercar or a penthouse. It was an act of restorative justice. It was a promise. I earned it, Eleanor said softly. Serena's expression hardened. It was the answer she expected. The vague, unverifiable claim of someone with something to hide. In her world, wealth announced itself. It wore bespoke suits, carried designer handbags, and spoke in a language of casual entitlement. It did not wear faded denim and speak of earning things. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow louder than a shout. Look around you, Miss Vance. This is a private lounge. It's for our clients. People who have built relationships with us, whose assets we manage and protect. We can't have just anyone walking in off the street and making demands. The insult was perfectly crafted, wrapped in the language of procedure and professionalism. You are not one of us. You do not belong here. Eleanor's patience, a deep and vast reservoir, was beginning to show the bottom. She maintained her calm exterior, a stillness she had perfected over years of being underestimated. While Serena saw a threat to her bank's security, Eleanor saw a symptom of a deeper sickness, one she had purchased this bank to cure. She subtly lifted her left hand, which had been resting on her lap. On her wrist was a simple, elegant smartwatch with a dark screen. With a practiced, almost invisible movement of her thumb, she tapped the side of the bezel twice and swiped down. It was a gesture so small, so discreet, it was lost to the room. But miles away, in the cold, humming heart of a secure server farm, it was a thunderclap. A program, codenamed Phoenix, silently awoke. Its first directive was absolute. Log everything, every word, every sneer, every rustle of fabric. The clock on the digital record began, precise and unforgiving. 10:17 a.m. Phase 1 was now active. Serena saw none of it. She was too consumed by her own certainty, her own role as the vigilant gatekeeper. She straightened up, her decision made. The performance was over. I believe we are finished here, she announced, her voice returning to its formal, dismissive tone. She looked past Eleanor, toward the frosted glass doors, as if she were already gone. If you wish to open an account with us, you may speak to a teller in the main hall. They can walk you through our standard application process. The dismissal was absolute. She was no longer a potential client requesting a transaction. She was a nuisance being redirected. Eleanor didn't move. She simply watched Serena, her gaze unwavering. She saw the rigid certainty in Serena's posture, the conviction that she was doing the right thing, protecting her territory. She saw a woman who had climbed a steep ladder and was now kicking it out from under anyone she deemed unworthy to follow. I am not here to open an account, Eleanor stated, her voice resonating with a finality that made Serena pause. I am here to make a withdrawal. For a moment, the two women were locked in a silent battle of wills. The hum of the air conditioning seemed to grow louder. The distant city traffic outside was a dull, forgotten roar. In the polished reflection of the mahogany desk, their two faces were a study in contrasts. One, sharp, guarded, and coiled with suspicion. The other, calm, resolute, and holding the weight of an unwritten verdict. Serena broke the silence first. She gave a small, final shake of her head, a gesture of pity mixed with ironclad authority. I'm sorry, she said, though her eyes conveyed no sorrow at all. But that's not going to happen today. She turned slightly, a clear signal to the rest of the room that the matter was closed. Her message was clear. The anomaly had been handled. This lounge is for our verified clients, Serena said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the curious onlookers. I'm afraid you'll have to leave. Eleanor's silence was a vacuum, and the room rushed to fill it. The first voice to break the tension was laced with the easy arrogance of new money. Seriously, Serena? Why are you wasting your time with this drifter? Caleb Thorne, a tech investor whose company had been a minor, flashy competitor before Vance Technologies acquired it, pushed himself out of his armchair. He swaggered toward the desk, phone held aloft like a scepter. His smirk was a gash of condescension. Maybe she won the lottery and thinks she's the Queen of England, he said. his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. As he passed Eleanor's chair, he feigned a stumble, knocking her simple canvas tote bag from the adjacent seat. It landed on the marble floor with a soft, unremarkable thud. A tube of lip balm rolled out, followed by a dog-eared paperback and a set of keys on a plain metal ring. The contents were so profoundly normal, so devoid of luxury, that it seemed to confirm Caleb's every prejudice. Before Eleanor could even react, another voice cut through the air, sharp and clear. "You've no right to speak to her that way." All eyes turned to Isabella Rossi, a young lawyer seated in a far corner. She was dressed professionally, but without the ostentatious flair of the other clients, and she was now on her feet, her expression a mixture of disbelief and indignation. "And you certainly have no right to touch her things." That was deliberate. Caleb spun around, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. "Excuse me? I'm a priority client here. Who are you?" "I'm a person with basic decency," Isabella retorted, taking a step forward. "Something you clearly lack." From a discreet table near the window, a young man named Leo Chen, who looked to be a college student, quietly lowered his gaze to his phone. He held it low, angled just so. In the dim light of the lounge, no one noticed the tiny red dot glowing in the corner of his screen. Serena's face, which had been a mask of cool authority, now tightened into a knot of pure frustration. She didn't see Caleb as the problem. She saw Eleanor as the source of the chaos, the foreign element that was disrupting the finely tuned ecosystem of her lounge. This spectacle, the argument, the whispers, the challenge to her control it, was all Eleanor's fault. She stepped between Caleb and Isabella, a peacemaker who had already chosen a side. "Thank you for your concern, Miss Rossi," she said, her voice dripping with strained politeness. "But we have security protocols in place to handle these situations. I'll ask you both to please return to your seats." She gave Caleb a placating nod before turning her full attention back to Eleanor, her eyes now flinty with resolve. The disruption had only cemented her decision. As she stared at Eleanor's unnervingly calm face, a ghost from her past flickered behind her eyes, the scent of rain on hot asphalt, the cheap, sickly sweet cologne of a man with a smile like polished silver and eyes like empty vaults. She was a child again, 10 years old, hiding at the top of the stairs. She remembered the man's smooth, reassuring voice, promising impossible returns, her father's hopeful questions, her mother's hesitant trust. And she remembered the silence that came weeks later, the hollowed-out look on her mother's face, the way her father's broad shoulders slumped in a way they never fully straightened again. They had been scammed. A well-dressed, confident man had walked into their lives and walked out with their future, leaving behind nothing but shame and debt. He had looked so plausible, so convincing. Never again, the 10-year-old Serena had vowed, "I will never be fooled. I will never let anyone I'm responsible for be fooled." The memory solidified her certainty into a shield of ice. This woman, with her quiet defiance and her impossible story, was the same archetype. A predator cloaked in the guise of the ordinary. Serena's professional duty and her personal trauma were now one and the same. Protecting the bank was protecting her family's memory. It was an act of vengeance against a ghost. She turned to her deputy manager, Marcus Holloway, a sharp young man she had personally mentored, who had been hovering nervously near the doorway. His face was a mask of conflict. "Marcus," Serena's voice was low, but it cracked like a whip. "Call security. This situation is out of control." Marcus flinched. He was ambitious, loyal to Serena for plucking him from the teller line and giving him a chance. But this felt wrong. It felt precipitous. "Serena, maybe we should just," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "We haven't even run her name through the high-level internal network. What if she's a con artist trying to use the acquisition chaos to her advantage?" Serena cut him off, her voice dangerously quiet. "That network is for legitimate prospects, Marcus, not for people who cause a scene. I have made a judgment call. Are you going to follow it, or do I need to question your position as well?" The threat was unspoken but clear. Marcus's gaze darted from Serena's unyielding face to Eleanor's unnerving calm. He was caught between his mentor's iron will and a stranger's profound stillness. The instinct that had helped him survive in the cutthroat world of finance screamed at him to obey. He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the tense silence. He pulled a radio from his belt, his hand trembling slightly. He looked at Eleanor one last time, a flicker of apology in his eyes, before turning away. "This is Holloway in the private lounge," he mumbled into the device, his voice strained. We require security assistance." Serena watched him, a grim satisfaction settling over her. The first step had been taken. The protocol was in motion. She looked back at Eleanor, who hadn't moved a muscle, hadn't betrayed a single emotion. It was that very composure that infuriated Serena the most. It was the calm of a predator who knew she had her prey cornered. But Serena knew better. She was the one in control here. She was the one protecting the flock. "You were given a chance to leave quietly," Serena said, her voice devoid of all warmth. "You chose this instead." The click of the radio's transmit button was a point of no return. Marcus Holloway felt it in his gut, a cold, sinking stone of regret. He had wanted to argue further, to insist on a simple database check that would take less than 30 seconds, but Serena's gaze had been a wall of ice. Questioning her now felt like career suicide. He had seen what happened to others who crossed her. They were reassigned, their projects stalled, their ambitions quietly starved into submission. He had a family. He had student loans. He made the call. It didn't take long. The frosted glass door swung open, and Frank Miller stepped inside. He wasn't the imposing, tactical, gear-clad security one might expect at a high-end financial institution. Frank was in his late 50s, his uniform slightly rumpled, his face a roadmap of tired resignation. He was a former Chicago cop who'd taken this gig for the quiet hours and better pay. A man who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. He moved with a slow, deliberate plod, his eyes scanning the scene not for threats, but for the path of least resistance. His gaze passed over the indignant lawyer, the smirking tech bro, and the conflicted deputy manager, finally settling on Eleanor. He saw a middle-aged woman in jeans. This, apparently, was the disturbance. "Ma'am," Frank said, his voice a gravelly monotone. "Manager says you need to leave. Let's make this easy on everyone and go for a walk." Eleanor didn't move from her chair. She simply tilted her head, her eyes locking onto his. "I am a client of this bank, conducting a legitimate transaction. I am not going anywhere." Frank sighed, a sound heavy with years of dealing with people who refuse to accept reality. "Look, lady, I don't make the rules. I just work here. She says you go, you go. We can do this in the lounge, or we can do it on the sidewalk. Your choice." "I'm choosing a third option," Eleanor said, her voice dropping, gaining a weight that made Frank pause. "It's the one where you go back to your desk and your manager verifies my account. And if you lay a hand on me, that will be assault. That will be unlawful restraint. And I assure you, the consequences will be far more severe for you than for me." Frank hesitated. He'd heard threats before, 1,000 of them, but this one was different. It wasn't loud or hysterical. It was calm. It was factual. It was delivered like a legal statement. He glanced back at Serena, looking for confirmation. Serena's patience snapped. This woman's refusal to be intimidated, her gall to, quote, legal statutes, was a direct assault on her authority. She strode forward until she was standing shoulder to shoulder with the security guard. "She has been disruptive and has refused multiple requests to leave," Serena stated, her voice sharp and authoritative, aimed as much at Frank as at the rest of the room. "She is now trespassing." Eleanor's gaze shifted from Frank to Serena. "You are crossing a line you can't uncross, Miss Monroe. I'm giving you one last chance to reconsider." As she spoke, her thumb once again found the bezel of her watch. The gesture was a whisper of movement, but its impact was a silent earthquake. Miles away, the Phoenix program escalated its operations. It logged the official security involvement, then dived deeper, cross-referencing the employee files for Serena Monroe and Marcus Holloway. Digital flags bloomed like blood in water. 7 prior complaints linked to Serena's management, 2 to Marcus's. Each one had a depressingly similar conclusion: a neat digital tombstone. Dismissed. Unverified. Client non-compliance. A pattern of behavior was no longer an allegation. It was now a data point. Serena, oblivious to the digital net tightening around her, saw only defiance. The memory of the smiling conman, the ghost of her family's ruin, rose up, demanding action. This was her chance to finally win a battle she had lost as a child. She would not be weak. She would not be fooled. She turned to Frank, her voice ringing with the absolute conviction of someone who believes they are righteous. Frank, she is not complying. Remove her. Then, seeing the lingering hesitation in his eyes, she delivered the final, irrevocable blow. If she resists, consider it a hostile act. Call the Chicago PD, tell them we have a potential bank fraud situation in progress. A collective gasp went through the room. Bank fraud. Those words changed everything. This was no longer a simple dispute about customer service. It had escalated into a criminal accusation. Caleb Thorne's smirk widened. Isabella Rossi looked horrified. Marcus Holloway visibly paled, rubbing a hand over his face as if trying to wipe the last 10 minutes away. Frank Miller's tired resignation vanished, replaced by the grim muscle memory of his old job. Bank fraud were keywords that triggered a different set of protocols, a different level of response. He reached for the radio on his shoulder. In the sudden, suffocating silence of the lounge, broken only by the faint hum of the server racks in the corner, a new sound began to filter in from the outside world. It was distant at first, a faint, familiar cry weaving through the city's ambient noise. But it was growing steadily louder, closer. The sound of sirens. The wail of the sirens grew from a distant cry to an urgent, street-level reality. Red and blue lights flashed against the frosted glass of the lounge, painting the tense faces inside with strobing colors. 2 uniformed Chicago police officers pushed through the doors, their presence immediately sucking the remaining air out of the room. One was a younger officer, his face set with a by-the-book intensity. The other was older, Sergeant Millerno, relation to the security guard with eyes that had seen enough of the city's dramas to last a lifetime. It was his gaze that swept the room and settled on Eleanor, a flicker of professional curiosity in his expression. Serena stepped forward, her posture rigid with self-righteousness. She was the one in control, the one who had summoned the law. "Thank you for your prompt response, Sergeant. This woman," she said, gesturing toward Eleanor, with a sharp, dismissive wave, "is attempting to execute a large-scale fraud. She is impersonating a high-net-worth individual, has no verifiable funds, and has refused to cooperate. She is a potential flight risk." Sergeant Miller's eyes remained on Eleanor, who still sat, an island of calm in a sea of chaos. "Ma'am, is that true?" Before Eleanor could answer, before the officer could take another step, she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension with the clarity of a bell. "I came here today to withdraw $5 million, she began, her gaze sweeping past Serena to include everyone in the room. "That part is true, but the money isn't for me." She paused, letting the statement land. "It's to buy a house on the south side, a small brick bungalow on Carmichael Street." Caleb Thorne snorted, a sound of derisive disbelief. Serena's expression tightened, convinced this was some desperate, last-ditch appeal to emotion. Eleanor's voice grew softer, imbued with a deep, resonant grief. "The house belonged to Mrs. Evelyn Hayes. She was my high school English teacher. She was my mentor. She was the first person who ever told me I was worth more than the coal dust on my father's hands." The room grew quiet. Even Caleb's smirk faltered. 30 years ago, this very institution, Prestige Financial, foreclosed on that house. They used a predatory instrument they called the Legacy Fund to strip her of her equity and put her on the street. She died 5 years later, never getting her home back. Eleanor's gaze finally settled on Serena, and for the first time, a glimmer of profound sadness showed in her eyes. "Today is the 30th anniversary of that foreclosure. Today is the day I came to buy her legacy back from the people who stole it." A thick, heavy silence descended. The name Evelyn Haysand, the specific accusation of the Legacy Fund, acted like a chemical agent in the room, changing its very composition. Frank Miller, the security guard, who had been standing stiffly by the door, took an involuntary step back. His face, once impassive, was now pale, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified recognition. Isabella Rossi, the young lawyer, let out a small, sharp gasp. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes fixed on Eleanor. The name, the fund. It was a ghost from the dusty archives of her firm's past, a name she'd seen on old, buried case files. Only Serena remained unmoved, her conviction a fortress against this new information. To her, it was just a more elaborate lie, a more pathetic story designed to manipulate them. A touching story, Serena said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. But it doesn't change the facts. You have no proof. Sergeant Miller, however, was no longer looking at Serena. He was a cop who had learned to trust his gut. And his gut was telling him this was more than a simple fraud case. He took a half step toward Eleanor, his tone shifting from procedural to cautious. Ma'am, that's a very serious allegation. But we still have the matter of your identity. Eleanor finally met his gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod. Of course, Sergeant. You're just doing your job. She reached for her simple canvas tote bag, which still lay on the floor. She retrieved her phone, its screen dark. She held it up, not to make a call, but as a prop. My name is Eleanor Vance, she said, her voice regaining its strength, its power. I am the founder and CEO of Vance Technologies. She let that sink in. Caleb Thorne's jaw literally dropped. Marcus Holloway looked like he might be sick. And, as of 9 a.m. last Tuesday, she continued, delivering the final devastating blow. Vance Technologies completed its acquisition of this bank's parent company, which means, for the past 6 days, she paused, letting her eyes travel from the stunned police officer to the security guard, to the lawyer, and finally, locking them onto Serena Monroe's horrified, disbelieving face. I have been the majority owner of this bank. The silence that followed Eleanor's declaration was absolute. It was a physical presence, a crushing weight that pressed down on every person in the lounge. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the faint rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, marking time in a world that had just been irrevocably altered. Serena Monroe's face was a canvas of disbelief, the blood draining from it until her skin was the color of ash. The fortress of her certainty, so impenetrable just moments before, crumbled into dust. This wasn't possible. It was a trick, a nightmare. Then, Eleanor's phone chimed. The sound was soft, but in the dead quiet, it was as loud as a gunshot. She tapped the screen, and a voice crisp, professional, and amplified by the phone speaker, filled the room. This is Anya Sharma, Chief of Staff for Eleanor Vance at Vance Technologies. I can confirm for Sergeant Miller of the Chicago PD that Miss Vance is who she says she is. A full digital confirmation packet, including articles of acquisition and a letter of authority, has just been securely transmitted to your department's official email and to the branch's senior management terminal. You may verify it now. Sergeant Miller's partner, who had been silent, pulled out his own phone, his eyes widening as he read the incoming dispatch. He looked at his sergeant and gave a short, sharp nod. The verification was real. The unraveling began. Eleanor stood up from the chair. Her movements were slow, deliberate, no longer the posture of a patient woman waiting, but of an owner taking inventory of her property. Her gaze, now cold as a winter sky, swept across the room. It landed first on Caleb Thorne. He was trying to shrink into his expensive suit, his earlier arrogance replaced by a craven, dawning terror. Mr. Thorne, Eleanor's voice was quiet, but carried an immense weight. Your disruptive behavior and public humiliation of a person you believe to be powerless is not something Vance Technologies tolerates in its partners. Anya, please note, initiate the process to divest from Mr. Thorne's company and terminate all personal and corporate accounts he holds with any Vance-affiliated institution, effective immediately. On the phone, Anya's voice was immediate. Acknowledged. Process initiated. Caleb stared, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. The millions in venture capital, the priority banking status, all of it, gone with a single sentence. Next, Eleanor's eyes found Frank Miller, the security guard, who was now leaning against the wall as if his legs could no longer support him. "Mr. Miller," she said, "security is meant to de-escalate, to protect all individuals, not to act as a personal enforcer for a manager's prejudices. You failed in that basic duty. You are dismissed." Frank simply nodded, a flicker of something that might have been relief in his tired eyes. He had been a pawn, and he knew it. Then she turned to Marcus Holloway. The young deputy manager was standing frozen, his face a mask of shame and regret. He looked like a man watching his life's ambitions burn to the ground. Eleanor paused, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. She saw not a villain, but a coward, and there was a difference. "Mr. Holloway," she said, her tone clinical. "You stood by. You were complicit in your silence. You had a choice, and you chose to obey an unjust order. That makes you a liability." She paused. "So, you have one more choice to make, right now. You can remain silent, and you will follow Mr. Miller out that door. Or you can tell me what is really going on in this branch. Tell me why my teacher's name, Evelyn Hayes, made your security guard turn pale." Marcus looked from Eleanor's demanding gaze to Serena's shattered one. The loyalty that had bound him to her was gone, replaced by the stark, terrifying clarity of self-preservation. Finally, Eleanor turned her full attention to Serena. The branch manager was trembling, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at her sides. "The architect of this disaster, and you, Miss Monroe," Eleanor said, the quiet fury in her voice more chilling than any shout. "You judged, you profiled, you humiliated, and you escalated. You used your authority not as a tool, but as a weapon. You wielded this institution's power against a person you deemed beneath you. There is no place for you in my company. You are fired." Serena flinched as if struck. The word fired seemed to break the spell that had held her frozen. A raw, guttural sound escaped her lips. A sound of pure, unadulterated rage born from the depths of her broken pride. "You don't understand," she finally screamed, the carefully constructed composure shattering into a million pieces. Her voice was ragged, torn. "You have no idea what it's like." Serena's scream echoed in the suddenly cavernous feeling lounge. "You have no idea what it's like to fight for every single thing you have, to build a wall brick by brick so no one can ever knock you down again. You don't know what it's like to have everything stolen from you." Her words were a torrent of raw, undiluted pain. This wasn't the calculated defense of a cornered manager. It was the primal cry of a wounded soul. Eleanor, who had been ready for denial or legal threats, found herself taken aback by the sheer force of the anguish. It shifted the emotional landscape of the room once more. This was not as simple as she had thought. Before Eleanor could process the outburst, a new voice, hesitant and heavy with guilt, broke the silence. It was Frank Miller, the now unemployed security guard. He hadn't left. He stood by the door, his hat clutched in his hands, his face etched with a conflict that seemed decades old. "The name," he said, his voice raspy. "Evelyn Hayes." He looked at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a miserable, ancient shame. "I remember her. I was a rookie cop back then. Just a kid. I was one of the officers who served the eviction notice." The confession landed with a sickening thud. The abstract history Eleanor had been fighting for suddenly had a living, breathing witness. "It wasn't a standard foreclosure," Frank continued, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken. "There was a whole program, a special portfolio. The bank called it the Legacy Fund. It targeted entire neighborhoods. We served dozens of those notices that year." He swallowed hard. "We were told it was urban renewal, progress, the Legacy Fund." The name was a poison dart from the past, and now it had been spoken aloud. Eleanor felt a cold dread creep up her spine. She lifted her phone, where Anya's line was still open. "Anya," she commanded, her voice low and urgent. "Protocol Phoenix, Phase 3. I want every piece of data you can find on something called the Legacy Fund. Cross-reference it with Prestige Financial Chicago from 1985 to 1995. I want names, documents, everything. Use every resource. Understood." Anya replied, instantly. Starting now. As if Frank's confession had given him courage, Marcus Holloway finally broke. He took a staggering step forward, tears welling in his eyes. The choice Eleanor had given him was no longer a choice. It was a compulsion. It never stopped. He choked out, looking at Serena with a mixture of fear and betrayal. They just changed the name. It's not a fund anymore. It's a product, a high-yield opportunity portfolio. They dress it up in sophisticated language, but it's the same predatory structure. Subprime assets, bundled and sold to specific demographics, they profile as high risk, high reward. He turned his pleading eyes to Eleanor. We're taught how to sell it. We're taught how to bury the risk disclosures deep in the paperwork. Serena, she knew. She taught me which phrases to use. She showed me how to flag the accounts so they'd bypass the normal compliance checks. The accusation was damning. It painted Serena not just as a prejudiced manager, but as an active, willing conspirator in a modern-day version of the very scheme that had ruined Evelyn Hayes. But then, the most unexpected thing happened. Serena, who had been staring into the abyss of her own ruin, threw her head back and laughed. It wasn't a sound of humor. It was a raw, broken, hysterical sound, full of shattered glass and jagged edges. Taught you? She shrieked, the laughter turning into a sob. Taught you how to hide it? You fool. I was trying to contain it. I tightened the approval criteria until almost no one could qualify. I rejected applicants I thought were vulnerable, giving them bogus reasons so they wouldn't get caught in the trap. I made myself the monster at the gate to keep the real wolves from getting in. She jabbed a trembling finger at Eleanor. I stood here and judged you because that's what I do. I stand guard. I look for the predators, the smiling con men, the ones who come to steal everything from good, hard-working families. The raw fury in her voice was undeniable, but her logic was twisted, warped by years of fighting a secret war. She had become the very thing she swore to destroy. Eleanor's mind raced, trying to connect the pieces. The fierce, protective rage, the story of being scammed, the obsessive vigilance. A cold, dreadful question formed in her mind. She took a step closer to the unraveling woman. Her voice was no longer that of a CEO or an owner. It was quiet, direct, and piercingly human. Which family, Serena? She asked softly. Whose family are you trying to protect? Serena stared at her, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The walls she had built around her heart for decades finally gave way. The last brick crumbled, revealing the raw, festering wound at the center of it all. My family, she whispered, the fight draining out of her, leaving only a hollowed-out emptiness. She looked Eleanor straight in the eye, and the shared, terrible truth hung between them. The legacy fund, Serena said, her voice cracking. It took everything we had too. The confession fell into the stunned silence of the room, rewriting the entire narrative in a single, devastating stroke. Serena Monroe, the antagonist, the gatekeeper. The enforcer was also a victim. She and Evelyn Hayes were two branches of the same poisoned tree. The enemy she had been fighting wasn't Eleanor. It was a ghost that had haunted them both for 30 years. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Marcus stared at his former mentor, his condemnation turning to a horrified, dawning understanding. Sergeant Miller shook his head slowly, the pieces of a long-forgotten puzzle clicking into place in his mind. This wasn't just a bank, it was a crime scene. And the crime was decades old. Then, Eleanor's phone pinged again. It was Anya. Eleanor, her voice was tight, stripped of its usual professional calm. I have it. I have the original incorporation documents for the legacy fund from 1988. It was established by the bank's founding partners. It's exactly what you thought. But there's more. I have the first-year victim ledger, a list of the first families they targeted. Anya went quiet for a beat, as if steeling herself. I'm sending the file to your tablet now. Eleanor's hands were steady as she picked up her tablet from the desk where it had been forgotten. The screen flickered to life, displaying a scanned, yellowed document. It was a ledger, the names typed out with a precise, impersonal clack of an old typewriter. At the top of the list, under account number 001, was the name Hayes, Evelyn M. Eleanor's breath hitched. Seeing it there in black and white, made it brutally real. Her finger traced down the screen, past a dozen other names, a litany of forgotten lives and stolen futures. And then she saw it, halfway down the second page. Account number 017. Monroe Robert Dahlia. A cold, heavy certainty settled in Eleanor's stomach. She turned the tablet so Serena could see. Serena staggered forward, her eyes fixated on the screen. She saw her teacher's name. And then she saw her parents' names, linked forever on a list of financial ruin. The final, crushing proof. The monster she had built her life fighting against had been created in this very building. The system she had fought to climb, the one she had just tried to protect with every fiber of her being, was the very system that had destroyed her family. The carefully constructed walls of her life didn't just crumble. They were obliterated, reduced to dust and ash. She made a small, wounded sound and sank to the floor, her body unable to bear the weight of the truth. As if this revelation wasn't enough, another voice joined the chorus of confession. It was Isabella Rossi, the young lawyer, her face chalk white. "My God," she whispered, her gaze distant, fixed on a memory. "Langford, Price and Associates, my firm. Before I joined, back in the 90s, they were the primary legal counsel for Prestige Financial's foreclosure division." She looked at Eleanor, her eyes wide with horror. "I'm here settling the estate of one of the founding partners, Mr. Langford. His archives, I've been going through them for weeks. They're filled with these names. Hayes, Monroe, dozens of them. They were just files to me. Redacted, dusty history." She swallowed hard. "My firm, we processed the paperwork. We made it all legal. We were part of the machine." The conspiracy was no longer a secret. It was a living, breathing entity in the room, with its architects, its enforcers, and its victims all present. Eleanor stood in the center of the wreckage, the truth laid bare at her feet. She had come here for a simple, righteous purpose, to honor a debt to one woman. Now, she was standing at the heart of a generational tragedy. She had the power to destroy them all. She could ruin Serena, fire Marcus, sue Isabella's firm into oblivion. The justice would be swift, clean, and absolute. But as she looked down at Serena, a crumpled figure of profound despair on the marble floor, she didn't feel triumph. She felt a deep, aching sorrow. She thought of Evelyn, who had lost everything but had never lost her capacity for grace. What would she do? Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about restoration. The sirens had long faded. The police officers stood silently, witnesses now to a form of justice far beyond their jurisdiction. Eleanor walked over and crouched down, not as a CEO to a subordinate, but as one woman to another. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't offer platitudes. She just waited, until Serena's ragged sobs subsided enough for her to look up, her eyes red and empty. "Get up, Serena," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but firm, devoid of pity but filled with a steely purpose. "Your fight was never with me. It has always been with this legacy. And it's not over." She paused, letting the words sink in, a lifeline thrown into the abyss. "The question is," Eleanor continued, her gaze intense, "are you going to keep fighting it alone in the dark? Or are you going to stand up and fight it with me, in the light?" For a long moment, Serena didn't move. She remained on the floor, a woman hollowed out by the truth. The lounge around her was a tableau of suspended lives. The shamed deputy manager, the horrified lawyer, the stunned police officers, the disgraced investor. They were all waiting for her answer, for the final piece of this shattered puzzle to fall into place. Slowly, as if moving against an immense physical weight, Serena pushed herself up. She used a nearby chair for support, her movements stiff and uncertain. When she finally stood, she didn't look defeated. She looked empty. The fire in her eyes was gone, replaced by the embers of a long, misguided war. She met Eleanor's gaze, and for the first time, there was no shield between them. "What do you want me to do?" Her voice was a rasp, raw and broken. Eleanor stood, her expression shifting from intense confrontation to quiet, focused resolve. This was the turning point, not the moment of revelation, but the moment of choice. Today, Eleanor announced, her voice resonating with a new kind of authority, one that was not about ownership, but about responsibility. The legacy fund dies. Its modern-day successor dies. But justice is just beginning. She didn't look at Serena as she laid out the new terms of engagement. She spoke to the entire room, to the witnesses of this collapse and the potential architects of what came next. "You're not fired, Serena," she said, and a flicker of shock crossed Serena's face. That would be too easy. That would be an ending. "I'm interested in a beginning." She paused. "I'm creating a new independent division within the Vance Foundation, the Justice Restoration Program. Its sole mission will be to identify every single family victimized by the Legacy Fund and its successors, and to make them whole. Reparations, scholarships, small business grants." She finally turned her gaze fully on Serena. "I need someone to lead it. Someone who understands the system from the inside out. Someone who knows the pain it caused. Someone who has a debt to repay." It wasn't a job offer. It was a sentence. A chance for penance. A path out of the darkness. Serena stared, speechless. The opportunity was so much harder, so much more profound than simply being fired. Eleanor then turned to Marcus. "Mr. Holloway, you will work with Serena. Your knowledge of the current system's loopholes will be your tool to expose them, not exploit them. You will help her navigate the bureaucracy you helped maintain. This is your chance to undo the harm you enabled." Marcus, who had been expecting ruin, could only nod, his face awash with a mixture of terror and overwhelming relief. Next, her eyes found Isabella Rossi. "Miss Rossi, your firm has a moral and ethical stain on its history. I expect they will want to scrub it clean. I want a proposal on my desk by Monday for a pro bono partnership. Your firm will provide all necessary legal services to the families we identify, free of charge. Consider it their contribution to justice." Isabella straightened up, her earlier indignation replaced by a lawyer's focused determination. "You'll have it," she said without hesitation. Even Leo Chen, the student journalist who had been quietly recording, found himself drawn into the orbit of Eleanor's new world. "Mr. Chen," Eleanor said, acknowledging him for the first time, "you have a story here. But the real story isn't the scandal. It's what happens next. The Vance Foundation offers a paid journalistic fellowship every year. I want you to apply. I want you to document this. Tell the story of restoration, not just ruin." Leo lowered his phone, his eyes wide with an opportunity he could never have imagined. The police officers, now understanding they were far outside the bounds of a simple fraud call, began to quietly make their way to the door. Sergeant Miller paused as he passed Eleanor. "What you're doing here, ma'am?" He started, then just shook his head. "It's more justice than I've seen in 30 years on the force." With the new order established, Eleanor walked to the mahogany desk and completed the paperwork for the $5 million withdrawal. The transaction that had started this firestorm was now a quiet, simple formality. The final scene did not take place in the cold marble lounge, but on a sun-drenched street on the south side several weeks later. The small brick bungalow on Carmichael Street was no longer forlorn. It had been repaired, its windows washed, its porch painted. A vibrant garden planted in the front yard. A simple bronze plaque had been installed next to the front door. It read, "The Evelyn Hayes Center for Justice and Community Renewal." Eleanor stood on the sidewalk beside Serena. They weren't friends. The chasm between their experiences was too wide for that. But a fragile, respectful alliance had been forged in the crucible of that day at the bank. Serena, now dressed in simple, practical clothes, looked at the house with an expression of profound, aching sorrow and a glimmer of fierce, newfound purpose. "The first reparations checks go out next week," Serena said quietly. "We found 12 more families in the first wave. The Monroes are not on that list. We'll be the last, after everyone else is taken care of." Eleanor nodded. "That's right." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a single, newly cut brass key. She held it out to Serena. Evelyn believed that the only way to fix something broken was to build something better in its place. Eleanor said, "This is the headquarters for your program." For our program, Serena looked at the key, Then at Eleanor, her eyes shining with unshed tears. This was the legacy. Not the fund that took, but the house that gave back. She would have wanted you to be the one to open the door, Eleanor said softly. Serena's fingers trembled as she took the key. She walked up the newly painted steps. The same steps Evelyn Hayes had walked down for the last time 30 years ago. With a deep, steadying breath, she slid the key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click. She pushed the door open, stepping out of the long, dark shadow of the past and into the warm, sunlit promise of a future waiting to be built from the ashes.